I'll try to be.
Those pants.
Try to be.
All right. So I see this. All right. Thanks everyone for coming to the night's neighborhood parking program City Council work session. Kelly, I always forget. Do we take the roll on these?
We don't have to.
We don't have to. All right. So we won't. But we're still waiting on Councilor Bagley. I'm sure he'll be here. Sorry. I read Councilor Moreau and Councilor Bagley, but we're going to pass it over to you two to give a presentation. I would ask that we, I know we have until scheduled until 7:30 on this. Is that my
8 o'clock, I think.
Is it 8 o'clock all the way till 8? Okay. Well, I would like to go through these slides. A lot of folks, well, I got to read them this afternoon, but if we could keep this part of the discussion moving as quickly as we can so that we can get time for questions. That's pointed at both of you. Councilor Moreau.
No, I said I'm going to elbow him every time he talks too long. I already prefixed that.
Pretty judicious with her words. We do start with a map of Portsmouth around 16 or 1800 here, so we're going back a ways to get to where we are. But we'll do that. Then we'll have discussion. Then there's time for public comment. We'll hopefully work for a process moving forward, and then we'll adjourn. So, Councilor Moreau and Councilor Bagley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mayor. I'll lead off, but Councilor Moreau and I have talked quite a bit about parking programs and parking management. And what this is just kind of a view from 30,000 feet about why we might want a parking program and parking management, and then some suggestions on what something like that might look like. And if we go to the next slide, this is Portsmouth in 1877. It's a pretty popular bird's eye view. I think a lot of people have it hanging in their homes or office. And the next slide kind of zooms in a little bit into the downtown plus the Islington Creek area. And the reason we're showing this slide is, when our city was developed in the downtown area, cars didn't exist yet. So there wasn't really much consideration given to parking because there was no need for it. And interestingly enough, these are some of the most desirable areas in the city. So it runs counter to the 1950s, 1960s theory of that you should design around parking when you build a community. So the next slide shows the current downtown parking management system. So the stuff in red is parking area A. The stuff in blue is parking area B. The blue and orange are the two garages, and the purple down at the bottom is the Parrot lot that is free. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons that we're here tonight talking about a parking management program is, one, that there are some neighborhoods that could use it, and two, one of the bigger barriers to affordable housing is parking requirements. So one of the things we could think about is, instead of managing parking by requiring all new structures to have X amount of spaces, if we have a good management system, we can kind of proactively adapt to parking as situations change over time. So the objectives are to identify areas of the city that have parking demands that are greater than on-street capacity, either now or in the future. Tonight, develop a framework for managing the parking supply in a fair and equitable way. 3, design a cross-neutral program without adding to the tax burden. And then 4, kind of a lofty goal for tonight, examine the true economic and social costs of building and maintaining parking spaces. And the methodology: as the city continues to evolve, a sensible fact-based approach to parking management is desirable in our residential neighborhoods. Establishing a framework for a parking program gives residents clear and understandable path forward with concerns they may have regarding development. And some of our most desirable neighborhoods, including the downtown area, are illegal to build with current zoning and parking requirements. Next slide, please. The supporting stats just talk about some cities that in the 1950s and 60s knocked down a lot of buildings, put in a lot of parking lots, and it actually had a very detrimental effect on the economic and social well-being of those cities. So we kind of learned from those lessons that, as we did here in Portsmouth as well with urban renewal, knocking down neighborhoods to put in parking lots is not a good way to address parking shortages. Next slide, please. And I'll hand this one over to Councilor Moreau.
The pros and cons.
Or do you want to wait for the next slide?
It's all good. So in talking, so most of you realize that I actually live in the Islington Creek neighborhood where the pilot program has been running, and so this slide just talks about the pros and cons. So there is increased availability of on-street parking for the residents who live in those communities areas. It reduces or eliminates parking requirements for new development, helps affordable housing. It definitely increases walkability over time and reduces a lot of traffic and congestion and speeding in the neighborhoods. I know I've had several neighbors walk up to me and talk about how much nicer it is that people aren't speeding through the neighborhood looking for parking. People are actually going to different places, and they drive a lot slower, and makes it a lot safer for the small children in the neighborhood. Cons are, yes, it's an additional cost. There's additional staff and infrastructure, signs in the neighborhood, challenges for renters because they may not have their cars registered in the city, and the 72-hour parking limit that we have citywide tends to be a negative for somebody that might want to leave their car with a permit parked for more than 72 hours. Next slide. So what program parameters might look like, and because the Islington Creek neighborhood was the one where this originally started, I got together with some of my neighbors and we talked about what might framework look like. So $10 a month seemed like a boundary of cost that would actually work for someone that's renting. I didn't think $10 a month to be able to not guarantee, but give you a much more likely ability to have a parking space somewhere near your neighborhood. It could be tied to a license plate. It could be tied to a lease agreement if that is a problem. Any city resident could get a permit to park in the neighborhood. It wouldn't just be for the people in that neighborhood. So it would be city residents. We could go with no guest pass. We could go with, we had talked about getting one free guest pass per house. And then all the rest would be on-street parking through a parking app, so that the parking app would be how people could come into the neighborhood and pay for parking. And just like the downtown area, then the longer they stay, the more they pay. So that way we would actually be generating money based off of people coming to the neighborhood and then parking that way. Enforcement hours would match the downtown. We could give businesses at the rate passes. I say not limit the passes, but I think if you have the cost of the passes after 2, maybe 3 passes, if you put it up to what it would be equal to them to have to park in the garage for their employees, then they're going to be more apt to go use the employee parking program. So either making it equal or more than that, I think would be a balanced way to start to take a look at that. We talked about whether or not you decide an area by how many parking spaces in the area or by how many residential houses in the neighborhood. So it could be an area of 200 parking spaces or 100 houses or however you want to look at it. So these are kind of some of the parameters we started to talk about how we could formulate something together. We also talked about how to quantify the buy-in of the neighborhood, what percentage of the neighborhood needs to want to have a program. So things like that. Utilization of the neighborhood. There was a lot of numbers collected about our neighborhood, but what wasn't collected is based off, they say we only gained so many parking spaces, but the question is, who were those people that were parking there before and who were those people parking there after? Is it the same amount of people parking, but now it's people from the neighborhood versus people that work downtown or actually come in to be a tourist and park in the neighborhood and then walk into the town? So percentages of utilization, what is that number going to look like? Is it 65? Is it 70? Is it 75? And then we would have applications for these to be able to go to Public Works for review to make sure they meet whatever parameters that this City Council develops, and then it would have final City Council approval after that.
Next slide. This is just a quick example of what a petition might look like if you wanted to, incorporate your neighborhood into a neighborhood parking program. And then next slide, do your streets have a parking problem? Do people circle the block looking for parking? Is it convenient to find parking at the curb? How many parking spaces are occupied by long-term parkers? Do residents feel new development and traffic it will bring? Next slide, please. Many residents are concerned. We hear over and over again, anytime anything new is built in the city, What about parking? We don't have enough parking for that. That is a primary concern of a lot of residents with any new development. Trends across the country are to eliminate parking minimums, not expand them. But we don't want to eliminate parking minimums or reduce parking minimums unless we have a safety valve for a parking management program if it were to be needed in the future. And a lot of the stuff we're talking about here is maybe not necessary today, but could be necessary in 10 or 20 years. And, you know, we all want to be environmentally friendly. And by having denser residential areas, that accomplishes that several ways. For instance, the city expenses, you know, most of our houses have gas, electric, sewer. Police and fire response is dependent on how far they have to travel. So the closer together households are, the cheaper those costs are because the pipes aren't as long, the electrical wires aren't as long. So the revenue generated by the city per individual housing unit is higher relative to the cost. So there's an efficiency there, and it's also more environmentally friendly because it allows us to leave bigger sections of green space elsewhere in the city. And the next slide. So this was a presentation given in 2018 or 2019, and what it's showing is value per acre. And if we go to the next slide, this shows Rochester, Dover, and Portsmouth. And what's very interesting is one that Portsmouth really excels in value per acre. But the areas that have the highest value and thus generate the most tax revenue for the city are the densest areas, the downtown, with the exception of Lonza, which is on P, so it has its own unique characteristics, which is the spike to the left. But the really big spike in the center shows that where people want to live the most, i.e. they're willing to pay the most money, is in the neighborhoods that have a parking problem. So people aren't, in most cases, people don't buy a home because they can store a lot of cars there. Now, there are a few motorheads that would disagree with that, but most of us, we want to be able to walk to the coffee shop, or we want to be able to walk downtown, or we want to be able to walk to the playground. And you can only do that in neighborhoods where there's a certain amount of density. If everybody has a 1 acre lot, it just becomes geometrically impossible for everybody to walk to everything because, you know, you could walk half a mile and only go past 10 houses. So,
so to sum it all up, we are, as a city, they've recently put out an RFP to have a parking study done through the DPW, which is going to inform a lot of our land use changes that might need to happen around parking. We're heading into, obviously, another year of hopefully looking at more policy changes around our zoning, and that should be one of them. It might also help us, give us some more information around how we might want to structure a citywide parking management program. And when we're talking, I'm not talking about the entire city. I'm talking about wherever there's a neighborhood adjacent to a downtown where there is sort of the creep and crawl of the people from the downtown where they have to pay to neighborhoods outside it. And drawing a line, I don't know, but I'm hoping the study will really help us be able to put some boundaries around where those areas are. For the short term, with the neighborhood that has had the pilot program, so the question becomes, what do we do for the short term there? Do we put around some, you know, some boundaries around cost and qualifications and streets? And I certainly look to the city staff to possibly help us give a little input. Maybe they can help us figure out what might be the best thing to do and what might work for the whole neighborhood that we could then build off of in the future.
Councilor Moreau and Councilor Bagley, any questions?
Was that quick enough?
That was great. You guys got through the 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Exactly like I envisioned in my head. Perfect. Any questions on that? Assistant Mayor.
More, I guess, a concern point of discussion. You note in here that anyone from any neighborhood could get a permit for that neighborhood. I worry that it almost might have the opposite effect, where there are people that, you know, live outside of that neighborhood that work downtown, whether that's service industry, retail industry, or any other industry that you had downtown. You're now making that less expensive than the Foundry downtown worker program. So that would be my concern, and I think we have seen that in other neighborhoods. I know I personally have experienced it, where I've parked, say, somewhere maybe in the South End, and someone says, you can't park here, this is for residents. And I've said, well, I'm a Portsmouth resident, I'm just walking to the park. So my concern is that, obviously, we can't exclude residents, but I think that should be a noted concern.
I think you have to limit how many, like, you could get more than one permit for a household in the neighborhood, but I think no more than one for any household outside.
Outside,
I
okay.
would think that would be one way of being able to do that.
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. I actually spent the past week, talked to the parking director in San Francisco and in Portland, Oregon, some smaller cities around this country, and there was mixed feelings on that. A lot of the bigger places, they have multiple neighborhood parking programs, and you have to be a resident of that particular area. Other places open it up to all the residents because it's an equity issue. You know, we all pay to maintain the roads in the city. So the thought is you shouldn't exclude anybody from being able to park. And one example that was used was, you know, if your mom or dad lives in a neighborhood that has a parking program, but you live on the other side of town where there is no parking program, what do you do to go visit them? And one of the ways you manage that is if you're just occasionally parking in, say, the South End to visit a park, you're probably not going to spend, you know, the $10 a month for a permit. You're probably only going to do that if you're working downtown and walking into town, or you're there fairly frequently. But that would be one of the things that we would monitor over time and see if, you know, we need to regulate it more. Because what we don't want to do is create a program that's so restrictive that we end up with, you know, 50% utilization of the parking spots. We don't want nobody to be using the parking spots. We want to kind of find that magic number where everybody is happy with the usage.
And if I may, and when just in kind of the overview of this program, and when we're looking at parking programs, are we looking at 24-hour parking programs? I think about in the South End in like Boston, where it's residential only from, say, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. I just would hope that we would consider, obviously keep all considerations on the table when we're looking at long-term.
So the way it would work right now is the enforcement hours would be the same as the downtown hours, so 9 to 8, whatever it is. And outside of that, there's no cost and no fee, and anyone can park there.
And the reason for that is twofold. One, it's from a management issue. If we have one neighborhood sign up for this, we don't have to, you know, hire staff with different hours than the rest of the parking department. You know, everybody can kind of be interchangeable. And two, we don't know what the right hours necessarily are, so it kind of makes sense to start with what we have and build off of that.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Councilor Denton? Were these, Councilor Denton, did you have a question?
Yes.
Okay.
So I guess more of a comment, actually. One thing which a previous council went back and forth with was just that question. Who should be allowed to get a permit? Is it just the people in the neighborhood or everybody in the community? And I think they made the right decision saying everybody should be allowed to have access to a permit because everyone's paying taxes. So I like the idea of sticking with that.
Councilor Blaylock?
Thank you. I also checked out some of the old meetings Councilor Denton was part of back in 2019. And this was back when my father was the mayor. And there was a lot of discussion over who was excluded, who was included. I, for one, would want to not exclude anyone. I think that kind of had some unintended consequences, ended up kind of pitting neighbors against other neighbors, drawing a line on a neighborhood, you know, saying you're not in my neighborhood, you're in my neighborhood. I don't know. That doesn't feel very Portsmouth to me. I mean, the other thing I want to be careful with this is creating something that's too complex that would require more of city staff's time, because that's a look at another cost that I would look at. But yeah, I'll just add those comments.
Thanks, Councilor Blaylock. Councilor Cook, and then it's Councilor Tabor.
Thank you, Mayor. I had a question about this, at least 200 street parking spaces in a parking area. And the reason I'm asking that is that some of the neighborhoods we're talking about don't have 200 spaces.
Right, so the option was either looking at how many could qualify as a size that could apply for a program, one of the boundaries we might talk about is either parking spaces in the neighborhood or residential units in the neighborhood. And I think we really need to include like all multi-unit buildings. So if it's a 4-unit building, all 4 units would count as being part of that neighborhood. So it's just a matter of we're not giving you any concrete numbers. We're giving you ideas of ways that you can take a look at different areas around adjacent to the downtown and say, okay, you have, 100 houses or 100 residential units in this neighborhood. So if there's a certain percentage of those that agree this is a good idea, then you'd move forward. So it's kind of an idea. Do you want to deal with it through parking spaces, or do we deal with it through residential units?
And just as a follow-up, are we still focused on necessarily neighborhoods? From looking at the way this is drawn up, it could be a series of streets, not necessarily a whole neighborhood, is that right?
Like I just said, it could be however many houses or residential units within a set area. It could be, there's I looked briefly at the city of Dover. They actually only give permits, so many permits based off of how many parking spots on a specific street. So you have to apply for a permit on a specific street, and if you get put on a waiting list, if all of those permits are taken up. So they never give out more than that. I don't think that's quite the right way for us to do it, but you see how there's many different ways of looking at how you could do this.
And I'll just follow up on that. Thank you, Councilor Moreau. We have, defined neighborhoods in the city of Portsmouth that go back, a long time. And those particular neighborhoods may not make sense to utilize for this. So we didn't want to say, okay, you have to be what everybody thinks of as a neighborhood. It may be half that neighborhood or 3/4 of that neighborhood or half that neighborhood and half of a different neighborhood. But that's why we included that it really shouldn't be gerrymandered. What we don't want to end up with is, some crazy amalgamation of streets that kind of combine to create a parking program. We want it to be what somebody on a map could look at and say, okay, that kind of makes sense.
Councilor Tabor, do you still have your hand up?
Yes.
All right, hold on. I just want to, before we get too far, I do want to just call out, thank you for including housing as a part of this. I think oftentimes, there's a pushback. People say, well, we want more housing. It always comes down to cars. I think everybody in Portsmouth would want more housing if it didn't mean that they couldn't park in front, if it didn't have a negative impact on either the amount of cars in the neighborhood or, the amount of cars in the road. But right now we have no ability at all in the city to limit the amount of cars that get to park in the areas that we have. There's, we have plenty of, we can give exceptions to the requirements. Came up during the ADUs, but there's not there's no ability to limit. So I think this is a really important conversation because of its effect on housing, something that most people want more housing. And the Islington Creek ended up being the place where we had a parking program that was somewhat in the works, but there's a bigger impact outside of just parking in that neighborhood. So thank you for including that in that presentation. Councilor Tabor.
Thanks, Mayor. I wanted to talk a little bit more about the minimum 200. I was reading about successful parking programs. There's one in Minneapolis that literally goes block by block. And I think we got the street-by-street data for the Islington Creek project. There's a whole lot of streets, actually 13 out of 21 streets, where they don't even come close to the 75 or 80% pressure on utilization. So I think you'd have a hard time getting the majority of the neighborhood as it's drawn now to want to pay $120 a year. A lot of those streets don't need it. But I think if you went small, block by block if necessary, in Minneapolis, they required 75% of the residents to sign up, and they would only do it where they measured 33% of the parking stock was used by non-residents. That's a high bar, but I think that gives some kind of definition of the problem. You know, we're using this in neighborhoods where people have to park on the street in many cases, and employees from downtown or from other parts of town are beating them to it and park there all day. So if we had some measure of how many spaces are used by non-residents, and we allowed smaller units, because I think anybody can organize a block. Organizing 21 streets, that's
I don't know if I can organize my own block here.
I shouldn't say anyone. It's a lot easier.
I got Laura Panalakis on my block. She can organize the block.
Well, we've got neighborhoods that just want to be different anyway. But those are some thoughts I had. Is make it bite-sized. Look at how many spaces are used by non-residents to define the need, and make sure that the need is there, and don't try to force in streets where there's plenty of parking.
Yeah, we don't actually have those numbers for non-residents to residents that change over, because they were just counting how many cars in the neighborhood versus who was. So that's the hard part about not having that specific number, but it doesn't mean we couldn't look into that at a future date as part of an overall parking management program.
And I think, just to wrap up, I think the real thing we have to be careful of is, I think we should have a policy direction that it's always the majority, and a strong majority, that wants this, because you're going to inconvenience a minority that doesn't want it. They're suddenly going to have time limits. They're going to have to buy a permit. They may have to pay a meter if they don't. So, you know, I think we always have to, as a council, set a policy that this really has to have a strong majority to it. If you get 51% wanting it, that's 49% that have to suddenly pay for parking and be inconvenienced. And, you know, that would concern me.
Thanks, Councilor Tabor. And you mentioned Minneapolis, who had probably the poster child for zoning law changes when it comes to housing. It's interesting that they've done so much work on parking related again. Assistant Mayor.
Thank you. This would be directed to Peter and DPW. It was touched on earlier that we're going to be doing a parking study. Could you elaborate a little bit on what that RFP is going to look like and what information we're looking to gain from that?
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, City Council. Pleasure to be here this evening. Peter Rice, Director of Public Works. With me this evening is Mike Cassad, our General Foreman for the Parking and Transportation Group. I have to apologize, Ben Fletcher's not able to be here this evening. He had prior commitments based on early Thanksgiving. But if he were to be here, he would pitch.
He'd have some thoughts.
He would have some thoughts. So I try to channel. Ben. He lives and breathes this stuff. So the RFP, the proposals are due tomorrow, actually, and a lot of the stuff that's being talked about right now is really one of the drivers behind that RFP. As you may recall, back in 2012, there was some parking principles developed that were used to help inform land use decisions at the time. And so our current parking program, which I know there isn't a neighborhood parking program, but there is a downtown parking program. It has been very successful, and have to acknowledge the fact that the parking program contributes close to $4 million to the general fund in direct monies, $2.4 million in direct monies, and additional monies in services. So there's a huge value to the city in managing how people utilize parking. And because this is a past 10 years old, the original study back in 2012, we felt it was appropriate to do a revisit of that program. And it's a parking utilization, but it's also looking at our land use, the parking requirements associated with land use. Are we creating barriers? Do we need more? Do we need less? How do we use that to inform our land use decisions? So the discussion tonight is really timely. It kind of kicks off the process. So when we sit down with our consultants, we can be really clear about what council expectations are and what we want to see from this process. But you know, I would think we're really looking to follow the data. You know, what is the utilization truly? I mean, I know people feel inconvenienced sometimes. You know, I've lived all over the city of Portsmouth, downtown, on Maplewood, on Pleasant Street. I currently live on the corner of South and Newcastle, and I've experienced the challenges, you know, not having parking during the wintertime and not having, you know, having to move around and look for parking. So it's understandable, the concerns, and we want to make sure we address the areas that deserve the attention. The other thing we want to, as somebody that's responsible for implementing the decisions that are made by the council, we want to make sure the programs that are put together are manageable, that we don't create a disjointed, this one of the councilors said, you know, this kind of Frankenstein of different places. So our enforcement staff have a hard time figuring out, you know, is this enforceable area? Is this not enforceable area? You know, so that makes it easier for people to understand. It makes it easier for our staff to operate. And then, are we making it too complex for people to take advantage of? So we need to try to keep it a simple program, understandable, so we provide value to the residents that are paying for this program. So I'm not sure if that was a little long-winded to answer. It was kind of what the RFP is looking at, but also I plugged a couple of other things that I felt Ben would want me to plug.
We all know I'm a pro at being long-winded, so I think that was perfect.
Now, when is that going to be done?
It has not been locked in yet in terms of, we're going to select a consultant first, and then typically what happens is the scope creeps, so we add to it and the duration. We would envision probably a 4 to 6 month period.
So well before our, like, a 10-year planning in 2025.
Yes. Yep. Yeah, so we would anticipate that it would help inform that as well.
Councilor Cook.
Thank you. And thank you for coming today to answer our questions.
Our pleasure.
I had asked Ben Fletcher this question. I thought I should make sure that the council's aware. I'd asked whether or not it was, if we've ever done a study of distance from the downtown and parking in a certain perimeter rather than looking at neighborhoods, and he had said no. Is there, that we'd always considered neighborhoods when we talked about parking programs in the past rather than distance from downtown? In this study, is there a chance that you're going to be looking at distance from downtown, like a certain, like parameters that you could draw?
We have not finalized the scope of services yet, but we did talk about an expanded vision. You know, we didn't want to just look at the downtown, we wanted to look outside. I don't know if we framed I know we didn't frame the question the way you just placed it, or presented it, but I don't see why we couldn't, you know, easily look at it that way.
Thank you.
Councilor Lombardi, respect the applicant.
I've been listening a lot, and one of the things I think Councilor Blaylock brought up is that we don't want to divide up the city. I think that, you know, if we create areas of the city that have something that other areas don't, and it's a concern. I've seen that. I saw that in Boston. Became a very divided city, not by parking, but by transportation corridors. And but it seems to me that, you know, creating a process for parking for some and not others is could be a problem in that.
Thanks, Councilor Lombardi. I had a question somewhat related to that. Like this slide on, just remind us what the blue is again versus the red.
It's the value. So blue is the less intensive,
Zone
A
B.
is the higher intensive.
Yeah, it's
C,
a
A, and B.
$1.50 an hour.
Credit $2.
Okay.
$1.50 an hour in the red would be the high occupancy, which would be the $2 an hour.
Okay. So, like, I mean, it's always kind of, not always, because I'm 39 years old and I haven't always thought, about this. So for the last 3 years, though, in thinking about this, I'm wondering, why couldn't we just extend the blue into the Islington Creek, and then instead of have some parking pass, just people can whitelist their license plate for $100 or $120 a year, and slowly increase that? Would there be any negative effects that we would see under that, if instead of having to pay the meter, they could just, through the app or going down to City Hall, just remove themselves from, being enforced on if they actually lived in one of those districts?
So, if I may, Mr. Mayor, Mike, I'm not sure if Park Mobile has the ability to differentiate like that, or does it have, I know we can create a list of for the resident discount associated with the Park Mobile, but Mike, could you speak to that?
Well, that's a good question, Mr. Mayor.
Well, it's technology. They got to be able to do something.
The new software that we just purchased, which is called Ticket Track, has a module where we can insert plates. So when the enforcement runs the plate, it would come up as like a whitelist kind of thing.
Okay. I mean, I guess from the standpoint of trying to figure out how to, I think that we can look at it as two ways. We can look at it from a standpoint of there's a neighborhood parking program, or there's neighborhoods adjacent to the downtown. Downtown's growing a bit. You might need enforcement in, actually metering some of these areas, probably not with actual meters, but just another zone. But then what we run into is people living in those neighborhoods that don't want their street metered. And I would, I'd understand that, because I wouldn't want, if the ADU guys were like, all right, we're metering Thornton Street, I'd be like, why? There's no issue there. But there might be an issue here, and it might be worth somebody's to have their street metered if they're going to then, have a drastic discount on that. So I would like to know, I guess, a question, if I'm going to turn this into a question, how do we determine whether or not we're going to expand the metered area of the downtown and extend that beyond the current meters? What's the process to go through to examine that?
That's a good question. We've done it, if you recall, 5-6 years ago, we extended up Maplewood Avenue.
I don't even think it was that long ago, but you are correct. Maplewood, Vaughn, and Rains.
So we do it mainly, it's driven by utilization. So if we see areas that are heavily impacted in terms of the duration of the day, and if there's a need for that area, the businesses in that area are saying, hey, we don't have any parking because people are parking in front of our stores all day, and nobody can, my clients can't come. That drives the discussion, and that's actually what happened along that section of Maplewood Avenue. Is that some of the businesses were saying they couldn't, their clients couldn't get in because there wasn't spaces for them to utilize. And so we went ahead and expanded the Park Mobile, which is not a metered system, it's a virtual meter system to that area. So we would envision, if the decision is to look at the numbers and say, okay, there's a justification, there's a reason to go ahead and to create this program, we could easily expand the area
Mr. Mayor,
that
can
would
I
be
add to
covered.
that? Would that have been something done by ordinance change, once that was determined to be the area in need?
Yes, it would need to be an ordinance change.
Councilor Bagley?
Thank you, Mayor. And I'll just kind of quickly speak to that as well. That is a little bit how we imagined it, is you'd use the Park Mobile app. There wouldn't be meters or kiosks in the neighborhood. And if you were, say, visiting from out of town, or you were fixing a furnace, you'd use the Park Mobile app and you'd pay $1 an hour to park in that neighborhood. If you're a resident, your license plate hopefully would be in the system, and when they come around, they pop your license plate in and say, okay, this car doesn't have to pay. And it would be up to residents in the city to determine, is the $10 a month the better deal, or I'll only park there twice a year, I'll just pay the $1 an hour for the couple hours I park there. Now, the other aspect I think you were asking about is the difference between commercial and residential. So in the downtown, in the commercial area, it's important, if we want to be able to have viable businesses in the downtown, that we have parking turnover. So the methodology, the real reason we charge for parking is not the revenue, it's to create turnover. in the neighborhood, we're trying to create parking for people that live there. So they're kind of conflicting goals. That's why you have a slightly different program in a neighborhood versus what you'd have in the downtown.
So that does answer a question that I was also going to ask is, there are people that live in the downtown that would probably want the same system where they could just park in front of their house or their apartment. And that is if we had limitless supply for parking, would love for that to happen. But since we have to balance that against businesses that need people to come and frequent those businesses, we can't exactly have somebody that gets to park for $1 in the red zone there. So that would be a determiner between the commercial and the residential. And if there was a way, from an ordinance, if we were to go forward with an ordinance change in terms of expanding the parking, we would probably have for a street a pretty high bar in terms of 75% of the street that would be impacted wanting to, have, basically the trade-off would be you have to pay $100 or $120 a year, but what you get is us enforcing parking time limits and requirements on your street. That would be the trade-off there. And it could, people could still park there, but they would be charged. Okay. All right. Councilor Dent.
Thank you. I want to weigh in on two of the, outstanding questions which you guys have. One is regarding either not having guest passes or having one guest pass per house. I think the one guest pass per house made sense when it was free under the neighborhood parking pilot program. Here, I think it no longer would make sense to give away a free guest pass if everyone else is paying $10. So I would be more likely to support something if there weren't guest passes. And then the other remaining question is the buy-in percentage. I think the 75% was a very difficult hurdle for the neighborhood to meet when it was first proposed. 75% I think is the same amount required to ratify the Constitution, and we're not asking neighbors to do that here. So I think 2/3 or 66% might be a little more fair.
Councilor Bagley.
I'll speak to that, Your Honor. I kind of look at that as the real pivotal number of this, because, like I've said before, it's got to be more than 50, and it's got to be less than 100, because you would never get to 100%. And if you're doing it with less than 50%, that just doesn't make any sense. So what's a fair number that is achievable for a neighborhood that needs it? But it's still, at 66%, we're still, we've got 33% of residents that are upset that this program is now part of their neighborhood. So that is, I think, the difficult number we have to come up with. And I did a lot of research, and there does not seem to be an industry standard. Most of the industry standards that are in practice today for commercial parking zones are from a book, The High Cost of Free Parking by Donald Shoup. And there's a lot of research, and there's a lot of work, and there's a lot of data-driven solutions. But they really relate to commercial retail areas like our downtown. They don't really relate to neighborhoods. And when you study the country and even the world, community or neighborhood parking programs, they come in 1,000 different flavors. So what we're talking about here tonight, we're kind of in a unique situation where we could set some parameters with good data. But I think the most important number we're going to talk about is that what is the appropriate number for neighborhood buy-in to activate a program?
And I would think that would also probably end up on, how big the neighborhood is going to be. I bet if we were talking about putting a neighborhood parking program in front of one person's house, we could get either 100 or 0% on that. So if we have 3 people's houses, and there's some of these streets that, have 4 or 5 houses on them. And so, trying to figure out that, I think, is dependent upon also identifying, are we doing it a street by street? Like, what are the qualifications, and then if we're doing it street by street, what are I would love to not have to pass an ordinance each time another street wants to come on. Is it contiguous? Does it meet our ability to enforce, parking? Why would somewhere, close to my neighborhoods need a parking program, outside the downtown. So does it already have to abut an existing metered parking approach? And then, how many houses have to be included in that, or is it a street? So identifying all of those, does it have to be contiguous? How many, what constitutes the smallest area we can park? And then we could get to, I think, defining what the number has to be in order to move forward with, charging people for something that they are now getting for free. Councilor Cook.
Thank you, Your Honor. I would be really reluctant to move forward with something that required 200 spaces or anything even close to it to move forward with a parking program in a certain area. And I speak to this as a resident of the South End, where we do have parking problems, but we really only have parking problems on certain streets, and it is very limited. We actually only have street parking on a few streets that are in close proximity to downtown or Prescott Park. So there really aren't 200 spaces that we're talking about in this neighborhood. And there are spaces within that neighborhood and places where you probably wouldn't want a parking program. So I would say don't make the hurdle so high that it's impossible for a neighborhood just because of their size to even apply for the program. Because I can see how, and this is always the discussion in our neighborhood, I can see Hancock, I can see Gates, these are two streets that have parking that is overutilized, definitely. But then if you keep going in the neighborhood, there's very little street parking, frankly. There's street parking on Mechanic, there's some on Pleasant, but only towards the end. There's just not a lot of street parking in the neighborhood. But then once you pass South Mill Pond, you don't have the same problems that you have in the rest of the South End that you necessarily have with downtown workers parking during the day, or people parking for a visit to Prescott Park. So it's really a small portion of the neighborhood with very little parking. And I don't think that everyone even in that area would be in favor of this program, but I can tell you, you probably would get, say, 75% on Gate Street. So that's, I just think that we should be really mindful of that, that some of the streets that are closest to downtown are not going to ever constitute 200 spaces in a neighborhood.
Yep, and I think that's a good point, and it's also, I think if it's a part of an enforcement area and it's growing out, it probably doesn't have to be 200 spaces because it's an extension of what's already happening. Would like just to raise the point, we're talking about the downtown right now, but if there is, we're talking about new development that doesn't always occur in the downtown. So again, understanding how we would tie the amount of, or the ability to have off-street parking, might be something that comes up in the future, like the West End yards were, definitely outside of the downtown, but they have a spillover effect, an effect that they underestimated the amount of parking that needed to go into there, and there was a lot of people that were, feeling the pinch in terms of, Kate Street, for example, of parking outside of that. So there's a lot that's going in. I would probably support something that was a babyer, like a baby step in terms of solving the problem that's in front of us with the Islington, but also being able to grow, saying if we got a number of parking, a number of houses that were adjoining to the downtown that could, that wanted the benefit of parking enforcement and were willing to pay for that benefit so they could park in their house. Because as soon as we bring something, ideally it'd be something, it's right next to the foundry garage. Like ideally, like it would be, something that was more than the employee program at the parking garage, but less for somebody, that was living there, to be able to get people to the garage. Councilor Tabor?
I also was at the presentation about, with the spiky graphs about the tax base. And one of the keys to that high-value tax base was mixed use. And, in other words, mixing together residential and business. So, for example, in the West End, we've got restaurants on Islington Street like The Kitchen. We've got a business on Salem Street with 32 employees. We've got the old shoe factory that's got employees. And, one of the downsides to this is if you make residents-only parking, it's harder for those businesses, for their employees and their customers. I think the solution for that might be to go to the approach that Ben proposed in his little 1.5-page treatment of Islington. And he said, put out meters, it's $1.50 an hour, residents get their permit, they are exempted. What was your phrase?
Whitelisted.
Whitelisted.
Tech company. Yeah.
And so that way, customers to the restaurant or employees can still pay a small, pay for parking. And, if somebody's an employee, if they live in Maple Haven and they commute into work in that neighborhood, they can buy a permit. But I think it's important we consider the businesses, because mixed use is a lot of residents in the comments and all the data we have about the Islington Creek project, a lot of people said they like a vibrant neighborhood that has employees, that has restaurants, that has activity. I think that's important.
All right, I think I'm going to move, or we can move to the public comment. We still have the process for moving forward, so we can answer and ask questions after. But if anybody has anything that they would like to say, please come up to the microphone. Just state your name, your city, and you have as much time as you need here, given that I see only 2 people, so we won't. Oh, 3, sorry. Caught me in the back.
7 on Zoom.
7 on Zoom. So raise your hand if you'd like to say something on Zoom, so I can tell how many people. If we're going to limit the discussion. Nobody's raising their hand. Okay. Ken.
Okay, thank you very much. Ken Goldman, 271 Islington Street. First of all, I'd like to thank Councilors Bagley and Moreau very much for that very thoughtful and well-done presentation. It was really, I think it really helped to capture parking in the city as a whole rather than, just focusing on one neighborhood, which is what we've done up to this point. I have just a couple of things I'd like to talk about. You talk about a sensible, fact-based approach, and I think that's a really good way to do it. I mean, if you look at Islington Creek, where we've had the pilot for all these years, the facts have clearly shown that you have one section of the neighborhood that is fairly dense and probably does need a parking program. Then you have the other half that probably does not. And the facts, and if we follow that, and I think I heard people talking about looking at cutting down old neighborhood boundaries and being smart about it, I think that's a great idea. I'd like to talk a little bit about guest passes. I think guest passes are a very good idea, and for several reasons. Number one, right now there's an assumption that everybody has one of these. A smartphone, they can download the Park Mobile app, and they can set up a Park Mobile account, and they're good to go. Well, I know people who have flip phones. They don't have any way to do Park Mobile. One friend of mine doesn't even know how to text. So that means they will not be able to park in certain parts of our neighborhood if we do Park Mobile. No kiosks. It's something to consider. Also, when people come from out of town, the first thing they're going to have to do is set up the Park Mobile app, set up an account, hook up their credit card and do it. And the same for someone who's coming to do work at the house who may not have done work in this part of Portsmouth before. So I think in a lot of ways, having guest passes make it very easy for the residents and their guests. Now, I personally almost never park on the street. I have a 2-car garage. I have 2 cars here in Portsmouth, And if I park on the street once a month, it's a lot. And, I'd probably get a permit anyways just to be safe. But, my concern is mostly for people working at the house and for for guests. If you do a petition, Andrew put that up there, and I think we just need to be, if we're going to do that, be very clear about the boundaries of whatever area we're talking about, because I don't know if any of you had a chance to see the email I sent and some of the videos, but when they did that in Islington Creek back in 2019, it was a very malleable situation, and the boundaries kept moving, and it wasn't clear, and people were on the petition, but then their houses weren't included and that sort of stuff. So I think we need to be very clear. On the thing about going, possibly street by street, again, let's think about that and be smart about it. I mean, I live on Islington Street, and I cannot park in front of my house for more than 2 hours, ever. It's just, that's the way it's set up. If I need to park on the street, I typically park on either Cornwall or Rockingham. That's where I would probably park. But if you're doing a street by street, and you talk to all the people on Rockingham and all the people on Cornwall, and you don't include those of us in Islington, we could be back to where we were back in 2019, where there was a program and we were not included. So please look at that. Really, I appreciate the work everyone's done on this. I hope that we're going to stop focusing on Islington Creek now and start looking at the city as a whole. Islington Creek, we did the study there. I mean, we got mixed results depending on where we live, and I think we should just roll that into whatever we're looking at for the rest of the city and give the people who live there some relief right now. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken.
Hello, Brooks Stevens. I own property on Hanover Street, 440 and 442 Hanover Street. I've owned that property for 42 years, almost as long as the map that you showed earlier, the overhead map. I have that map, by the way. I like that map. The parking program, I have tenants there in this building now, and without the current parking program, they would be struggling to find parking places on Hanover Street. The property I own is between Rock and Brewster. There are 7 properties there. There are 4 parking spaces, because you can only park on one side of the street. So it makes it difficult. Thank God there are 11 spaces at the end of Rock Street, which helps with the overflow. So without the neighborhood parking program, it's very difficult for the tenants in that area. Coincidentally, a couple of weeks ago, I was driving through and I spoke to one of the parking attendants. And
Brooks, sorry, do you mind just speaking closer into the microphone?
I'm sorry, yeah.
Just for the folks that are tuning in.
Coincidentally, a couple of weeks ago, I was driving through and I was speaking to one of the parking attendants. And I asked him, I say, how's the program going? And he replies, I think it's working great. All the workers are not parking in the neighborhood anymore. All the patrons to downtown are not parking in the neighborhood, and the residents have their neighborhood back. I go, yeah, that's what I feel as well. And he goes on to say, I don't think it's necessary, again speaking to Councilor Tabor's point, from Brewster up farther to Rockingham, I forget all the names of the streets. He says from Brewster to Bridge is the identified area that he feels the program should stay intact. So I agree with spot parking that not all streets really need the program, only certain streets need the program. So, and as far as the cost, and speaking to my tenants and other people, I think it's a minimal cost, $125 a day. It figures out to 30 cents a day to get a parking pass to park your car in your neighborhood is well worth the fee that it would take. So, just a few of my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brooks.
Good evening, Elizabeth Bratter, property owner of 159 McDonough Street and 342 Cabot Street in the Islington Creek neighborhood. I have owned that property for 40 years. This year was our 40-year anniversary in November, and I have watched the neighborhood grow. When I moved in, people kind of shuddered at the thought of, why did you buy a house there? And now people are fighting to get in there. But what's interesting about the neighborhood, and there are a lot of neighborhoods in Portsmouth which have this, is that there are a lot of units that have no parking at all, or they have a driveway. We have a couple. There's one on Cabot that I can think of offhand, and our house is another one that we technically have a driveway, but you can only own a Mini Cooper to park there. If you have a family, you can't park there. So you can't fit anything bigger than a Mini Cooper, and it's hard to fit a family of 4. The other question I wanted to ask all of you is, how many of you walked here today or rode in something other than a car? So when Portsmouth looks at parking...
Josh was our only chance.
Yes,
and
that's
it's too cold
correct.
out.
And he was running late, and so was I. And Josh and I usually do walk, but he was running late, and so was I, so we drove. So the reality for me is that it's very idealistic. 20 years ago, when the parking programs were brought up and letters were sent and people asked about it, they all said, don't worry, nobody's going to be driving a car anymore because the neighborhood is so close to downtown and this and that and this and that. But that's not really true. And if you have a walking disability, as my husband does, he's not walking downtown. He's going to keep circling until he finds a spot. Luckily, he has a handicap plate, so he can usually find one. I personally walk because I can never find a space. But the reality is, when you're making this choice, and when you look at all of the things that were presented by Mr. Bagley and by Ms. Moreau, I want you to think about the reality is that most people do drive. And the West End Yards proved that most people do own a car. And it's my experience as having been a landlord for over 40 years, because when we bought our house, it came with a second house, that every bedroom is usually a car. So you have to think of it that way. So even though West End Yards use the minimum standards that Portsmouth says that they need, they asked for more because they're an enclosed neighborhood and they really had no place to go with their excess parking, unlike other neighborhoods. The great thing about the neighborhood parking program that happened was the businesses that are next to my location only had 3 permits, the maximum of. What's interesting is the landlord that owns the property that has all these businesses did not open up his spaces for free to his tenants. They still could only get 3 passes through the city. So that seemed to be a good spot. And the other thing that everybody forgets about is that when people receive CUPs, there is no one who enforces that CUP. So an example is there are a lot of CUPs were given to the businesses in the Safeway storage building. But the city cannot enforce them to use their parking lot if the landlord chooses to charge for it. So my thought is if you give someone a CUP, you might want to include an ordinance that says if you're given a CUP, the parking that you say will be happening in your parking lot will actually be happening as such. So that's one of the other issues people forget about. So generally speaking, I like the way you guys are thinking. It's very tricky. The concept to me when I look at parking is shared parking. So during the day with the parking permit program in the Islington Creek neighborhood, the people who worked left. And the people who had businesses or were going to businesses came and parked. And at the end of the day, the majority of people left and went home. And the people who lived there came and stayed. There was enough room during the day, except for on the Hanover Street end, which is always like a mob scene down there. But there was enough room during the day on our end, which is the other piece, because we have so many businesses where we are, that we could share those spaces. And I'm a big proponent of sharing spaces because it's environmentally very poor to have lots of empty spaces. But that's the trick, and that's the hardest part about parking generally. And I think we should call it a parking management program, as Dover does, because when you call it a neighborhood program, a lot of times people have a very interesting perception of what that means. And since what you have suggested is possibly looking at streets or blocks or smaller areas, I agree that you should probably take that out of the name, generally speaking. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Please take your time, and if you need to put it off, it's a winter, there will be no parking in our neighborhood because we have bump outs, and they don't plow our bump outs. Our bump outs, we shovel out ourselves if you want a place to park, and you better believe someone else will take your space as soon as you shovel it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you, Liz. A lot of great points in there. We have a few folks on Zoom. We'll start with Karina, and then, all right, so we'll do it now. Is anybody else, I see another hand, Nicole, just raise your hand. Anybody else that wants to speak, please do so now. I'm just trying to manage the time that we have.
First
All right.
up, we have Karina. Go ahead, Karina.
Hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, great. Sorry. I've not done this before. So, Karina Quintans, 51 McDonough Street, which falls into the Islington Creek neighborhood. I have what I want to call a rhetorical question that I just want to challenge some thinking, including my own. I have not thought through my question that well, but I'm speaking to the point of, if you have, for example, 51% that want the parking program and 49% that don't, this is a situation, for example, that we've been in for a long time, in which there's a bias towards the no position to move forward with this. And I've certainly been on many arguments on the no side. I'm on the yes side in this particular situation. I guess my question is, how long does the no bias stand? Because when we say that if there's 51% that want it and 49% that don't, then we're going to have 49% of the people pissed off that they have a parking program. But the alternative way to look at that is that you're going to have 51% of the people that have wanted it for 15 years pissed off in the reverse scenario. So I don't know what the answer is. I'm just trying to challenge the no bias that we often have when we're looking at a long time problem that has been advocated for as long as I've lived here and longer than I've lived here. So I'm not sure if I articulated that very well, but that's my attempt at putting this rhetorical question out there. And I don't need an answer right now, I guess. It's just rhetorical.
We can't, so we won't be able to answer you right now, Karina, but I think you did answer the question well. Our goal isn't to have 50% pissed off at the other 50%, it's to have 100% pissed off equally. So everybody is equally upset with whatever we do, but hopefully it's a small percentage. But thank you for calling, or for joining us. Next up, we have Byron. Byron, the floor is yours.
Hi. Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for digging in on this really hairy problem. Not a lot of good answers.
And Byron, do you mind just stating your full name? I know we see it on the screen.
Oh,
but
apologies.
Just Byron and city residence.
Byron Matto, 17 Fields Road.
Thank you.
I was saying not a lot of good answers here. I'm not going to help with that either. I just wanted to, and I think the previous two speakers ago, and then maybe Mr. Brooks, they were talking about, I think Mr. Brooks, it was his name, was speaking to on Hanover Street, so many units, there's only like four spaces available. I mean, so the reason I bring up that point is because even if you were able to manage that so that it was only for a specific group of people, or you're trying to sort of create a scenario in which those folks are able to park, there isn't enough parking for those folks. And that's because fundamentally, I don't think a city really is designed around the premise that everyone should be able to park a car, like every bedroom has a car. And that was to the speaker following him point about sort of there's this idealistic view around oh, we won't need the parking because everyone will walk, and that hasn't materialized. And I just want to offer that to some degree that may be the case because we continue to make policy and to some degree subsidize that specific behavior. And the reason why the change isn't coming is because we don't want to do the really difficult thing of actually paying what it costs to park a car in a space. And then further, like, one of the reasons there's so many edge cases around, oh, which streets is it and who does it apply to and those sorts of questions, and it gets really hard to sort of logic your way through that is because it's sort of an anti-pattern to public space in general. And so I know that's not helpful at all, but I wanted to offer that perspective, and thank you all for all the work you do. Thank you.
Thanks, Byron. Good to hear from you. Next up, Robin Huslidge. The floor is yours. Huslidge.
Hi, this is Robin Huslidge. I live at 27 Rock Street, right around the corner from Hanover, and in a hot parking area where we get a lot of people parking. And my personal experience is that the neighborhood parking program has hugely helped with the problem that we had where there was no place to park on the street. And I've talked to a number of neighbors who have really felt, and somebody mentioned earlier, that the neighborhood, the feeling of a neighborhood has really returned with the neighborhood parking program. That it feels like a neighborhood, not a parking lot. And I was talking to another neighbor that was saying they moved in, it was maybe the year before the neighborhood parking program, and they were seriously, they bought a house, moved in and everything. They were seriously considering selling and leaving the neighborhood because the parking was so bad, and it did not feel like what they thought they were buying into, which was a neighborhood. And they said with the neighborhood parking program, that completely flipped. So if you want Islington Creek to be a neighborhood with, families and, a vibrant neighborhood, then some sort of parking solution is really necessary. And I also echo what I think it was Ken Goldman said about the guest pass. Those 41% or whatever the percent is that don't want the parking program, they will want to engage with the parking program because of that free guest pass. It's critical to really making the program successful. It's hugely important. So I really encourage you to include that guest pass because it will really make it workable for everyone. So that's all I had to say. Thank you so much for everything that you've done and the excellent presentations tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. All right. I don't think we have any more speakers on Zoom or in the room, and I want to thank everybody for being a part of that and for those.
We do have, Nicole's having trouble with her hand.
Nicole,
Can I bring her up?
we can bring you up. I was surprised that Nicole had nothing to say.
Good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Nicole.
Oh, thank you very much. Nicole up here, 44 Rock Street. It's not a secret to any of you, but I think that the Islington Creek neighborhood parking pilot had many successes, and one of which was the people who now park on the streets are affiliated with the neighborhood versus before the majority were people parking all day, whether they were working downtown or tourists. So I would echo what Robin said about it feeling more like a neighborhood, and we are very blessed to have beautiful Rock Street Park. And in the couple decades I've lived here, there are so many more young families. My own children use that park all the time, other kids. The last thing I want to see is one of our kids getting hit by a car zipping around looking for parking when they're going to their park. Little dark, but sorry. I want to thank Beth Moreau and Andrew Bagley. Both counselors gave an excellent presentation, and I truly appreciate all the research they put into it. And I also really appreciate the thoughtful discussion all of you are having. For me, I followed this issue for so many years. So to hear it coming to finally being literally on the table and not kicked further down the road, I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the work you're doing and the study. So thank you all very much. It's much appreciated. Have a great evening.
Thank you, Nicole. And I think that tees up if that is the last speaker, I think it is. I think that tees up kind of what the next steps are. We're not deciding this today, but we should decide it by December 5th. So whether or not that's a study, whether that's to, have a motion that we discuss on the council in their council meeting, I think that we have as much information as we're going to have to make a call on December 5th, and I would look forward to having a motion under somebody's name to discuss, maybe Councilor Moreau's, to discuss what that looks like. It could be, could be further study in terms of, through the winter and waiting for a report back, as Liz said, it's the winter time is not the peak season for parking. So I do think we have a little time. I do think that this is a bigger problem, not a bigger problem, but a bigger opportunity than just Islington Creek. It's, this is our proxy war for all of the problems in the entire city when it comes to parking. And so a lot has been brought to that, but I would love to have, I'd love to have a path forward that, again, balances a lot of competing interests that might not be as robust as this pilot program. But as somebody, I walk this neighborhood almost daily. Councilor Moreau, I wasn't going to tell you, but I picked up my dog pooped in front of your house today.
Thank you.
So I was picking up poop in front of your house. I think there is a great neighborhood feel in Rock Street Park. There's a lot that's going on, and I frankly like being able to get. It's easier to get a parking spot to go to the kitchen than it was previously. So I do think there's a lot of intangibles that aren't not going to come up on maybe some of Ben's data-driven maps, and it's how do we get those into a program. But are there any further questions from the council of city staff or each other? And is everybody at least somewhat in agreement that by the 5th we will have a motion that we can decide what to do with, even if that motion is to wait, but to give the residents an idea of what comes next, because the parking program will end on the 4th. And so the 5th seems like a good time to discuss that. Councilor Bagley.
I just have a comment, Your Honor, to one of the speakers. I probably walked to 9 out of 10 meetings, but I did drive today. So.
All right.
It's cold.
Let that be the record. When asked, Councilor Bagley walks to the other meetings. Any other questions? I want to thank Councilor Moreau and Councilor Bagley. This is a lot of work went into this. When I saw this on my email, I thought we were going to be here for an hour and a half simply going through your slides. So thank you for making that presentation. I hope every business meeting that I sit through gets through those slides as effectively as the two of you did. I think there's a lot in here, and hopefully it set the stage for the conversation that will happen on the 5th. And every folk that are zooming in, please let us know things that you'd like us to consider, and please take a look at the agenda when it's released before the December 5th meeting so that you have an idea of what is going to be on the table for us to discuss. But thank you again for putting this together. And with that, we'll adjourn.